I was just about to head out for work, my mind already tangled in the usual morning rush, when I saw her, Mrs. Thompson, the elderly lady from the apartment across the hall. She was standing by the mailboxes, fumbling with a stack of letters that had seen better days. I offered a polite nod and a friendly good morning, expecting her to return the gesture and move on. Instead, she peered at me with a glint of mischief in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Oh, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling with age and a hint of something I couldn't quite place, "I've been meaning to tell you something." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. Mrs. Thompson had always been a bit of a gossip, but I hadn't anticipated anything significant. "What's that, Mrs. Thompson?" I asked, trying to sound genuinely interested. She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't mean to meddle, but I've seen your wife, Sophie, visiting Mr. Powell quite often lately. It's become quite the routine if you know what I mean." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my heart rate quicken as I struggled to process what she had just said. "Sophie? Visiting Paul?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. Paul Powell was our neighbor. Someone I had always thought of as an ordinary guy, recently divorced and living a quiet life. "Yes, dear," Mrs. Thompson continued, oblivious to the storm she had stirred. "I've seen her there quite a few times. She's always slipping in and out, usually when I'm home. You know how it is when you're retired and have nothing but time on your hands." I stood there, rooted to the spot, as her words echoed in my mind. Sophie, my wife, had been sneaking around with Paul. I had always trusted her implicitly, but now doubt began to gnaw at the edges of my certainty. My brain struggled to process the betrayal that was being laid bare before me. "Thank you for letting me know," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow and inadequate. Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil she had set in motion. She patted my arm gently before shuffling away, her mission complete. As the door to the building closed behind her, I stood alone in the hallway, feeling the weight of her revelation settle over me. I was numb, a myriad of emotions swirling within me: anger, confusion, and a strange, cold resolve. This was not how I had envisioned starting my day. I had always believed that the ordinary humdrum of life would be my biggest concern. But now everything had shifted. My wife's infidelity had turned my world upside down, and I was left standing at the precipice of an unknown future, grappling with a newfound sense of betrayal. With a deep breath, I forced myself to move, shoving the unsettling truth into the back of my mind as I made my way to work. But the shadow of Mrs. Thompson's words followed me, a constant reminder that everything I thought I knew about my life had just been shattered. I stumbled into my apartment, the key jangling in the lock as if it were a distant sound. The familiarity of my home did nothing to soothe the storm raging inside me. My mind was a chaotic whirl of disbelief and confusion, my heart pounding as if it were trying to escape from my chest. I dropped my briefcase by the door, too numb to care about the mundane details of my arrival. The hallway, usually a comforting space, now felt cold and alien. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breath, to anchor myself in reality. Sophie had been visiting Paul. The thought repeated itself like a cruel mantra. My mind raced back over the past few months, searching for signs I had missed, for clues that had eluded me. Had I been blind to the changes in her behavior? How had I not noticed anything? I moved mechanically to the kitchen, needing to do something, anything, to ground myself. I made a cup of coffee, though it was more for the ritual than for any actual need. The smell of the brewing coffee did little to comfort me. It was as if the familiar had been tainted by the weight of the revelation. As I sipped the hot liquid, I wrestled with the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. Anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of loss mingled with an unsettling calm that I couldn't quite understand. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, and I knew that reacting impulsively would only add to the confusion. I decided to focus on the facts. Mrs. Thompson's account was a revelation, but was there any room for doubt? Could there be another explanation for Sophie's frequent visits to Paul's apartment? I replayed our conversations, her excuses, and the little details of our life that had seemed perfectly ordinary until now. I needed to plan my next steps carefully. I could confront Sophie immediately, but that would likely lead to a messy confrontation, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I resolved to gather more information, to observe and understand the full scope of what was happening before making any decisions. I took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. I felt a strange calmness as I mentally prepared myself for the task ahead. My heart was still heavy, but my mind was slowly finding focus. I would watch, listen, and gather the pieces of this unsettling puzzle. The evening stretched ahead of me, filled with the mundane routines that now felt hollow. I tried to distract myself with chores and television, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the scene I had witnessed, replaying every word Mrs. Thompson had said. The image of Sophie and Paul together was a gnawing presence in my mind. As the night wore on, I resolved to keep my emotions in check and to approach the situation with a clear head. The future was uncertain, and I knew that the choices I made now would shape the path forward. With each passing hour, I steeled myself for the challenges ahead, determined to uncover the truth behind the betrayal and to handle it in a way that would bring me the clarity I so desperately needed. Chapter 3: Crafting the Plan. The next day began with an eerie calmness. I forced myself to act as normal as possible, but every gesture, every word felt rehearsed, artificial. Sophie was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Her back turned to me as she hummed along to the radio. The routine was so familiar, so mundane, and yet now it felt tainted. After a hasty breakfast, I announced that I had a few errands to run. Sophie, absorbed in her morning tasks, barely registered my departure. I kept my voice light, masking the turmoil churning inside me. "I'll be out for a few hours. Don't wait up." As soon as the front door closed behind me, a sense of urgency took over. I moved quickly down the hall, taking the stairs two at a time. My heart racing with anticipation. I reached the third floor, our building's top floor, and chose an empty apartment there. It was a temporary storage space that had been vacant for months, a perfect hideaway for what I had in mind. I entered the apartment and pulled the blinds, ensuring that I wouldn't be seen from the outside. The room was bare, with only a few dusty pieces of old furniture left behind. I found a spot by a window with a clear view of Sophie and Paul's building. It wasn't the most comfortable setup, but it would do. From my vantage point, I could see the entrance to Paul's apartment building. I settled into a chair, my eyes scanning the scene below, waiting for any sign of Sophie. I had prepared myself for a long wait, but my patience was fueled by a determination to uncover the truth. Hours ticked by slowly. I occupied my time by jotting down notes, noting every person who entered or exited Paul's building. Each time the door opened, my heart skipped a beat, hoping it would be Sophie. I kept a close watch, making mental notes of patterns and timings, trying to predict when she might show up. Around mid-afternoon, I saw her. Sophie's familiar figure appeared at the entrance of Paul's building. She was dressed casually, carrying a small bag. I felt a pang of something, hurt, anger, or perhaps just the sting of realization. Watching her walk confidently towards the building, I felt like an intruder in my own life. I continued to observe from my hidden vantage point as she entered the building. The minutes felt like hours, each one stretching out as I waited for her to reappear. I knew that this was just the beginning. I needed more than just these fleeting glimpses. I needed to understand the full extent of their interactions. As dusk settled over the city, Sophie finally emerged from the building, looking relaxed and content. She glanced around, but my hiding place was secure. I watched as she walked away, her demeanor serene, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions roiling within me. With Sophie gone, I decided to leave my hideout. The plan was starting to take shape, but there was still much more to be done. I had seen enough to confirm my suspicions, but now I needed to gather more information, to plan the next steps carefully. Returning to my apartment, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, and I knew that I was stepping into uncharted territory. As I unlocked my front door, I resolved to stay focused and vigilant. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but I was determined to navigate it with precision and purpose. The next day, I found myself once again in the abandoned apartment on the third floor. It had become my temporary observation post, a stark contrast to the home I had once found comforting. The emptiness of the space mirrored the hollowness inside me as I waited for Sophie's routine to unfold. The hours dragged on, and I clung to the hope that today would bring clarity. I had prepared myself for the worst, but nothing could have fully braced me for what I was about to see. Around mid-afternoon, just as I had witnessed the previous day, Sophie's figure appeared at the entrance of Paul's building. She was carrying a bag, her casual demeanor unchanged. I watched her with bated breath, each step she took further solidifying the painful truth that had begun to form in my mind. She entered Paul's building, and I waited in tense anticipation. It was an excruciating exercise in patience, each minute stretching longer than the last. I could feel my pulse quickening, the combination of disbelief and growing rage bubbling beneath the surface. When she finally emerged hours later, she looked relaxed and at ease, a stark contrast to the turmoil I was experiencing. The sight of her walking away from Paul's apartment with such casual ease was the final blow. The neighbor's words had been accurate, every detail confirming the betrayal that had been described. As Sophie disappeared around the corner, I slumped back in my chair. The weight of the confirmation settling heavily on my shoulders. The reality of her infidelity hit me with a jarring intensity, the shock morphing into a fiery rage that burned deep within. My mind raced through a whirlwind of emotions. The disbelief that had initially clouded my judgment was now replaced by a clear, harsh reality. The images of Sophie and Paul together, the little touches, the stolen glances, all of it was true. The neighbor's account had been accurate, and the betrayal was as deep as I had feared. The apartment seemed to close in around me, the stark walls echoing my sense of isolation. I had watched my wife, someone I had trusted implicitly, betray that trust most profoundly. The anger surged through me, a raw and uncontrollable force that left me feeling disoriented and lost. I knew I couldn't remain in the abandoned apartment forever. I needed to return to my place, to process what I had seen, and to decide on my next steps. But the journey from shock to action seemed daunting. The path ahead uncertain and fraught with emotional landmines. As I made my way back to my apartment, every step felt heavier, each one a reminder of the betrayal that had upended my life. The familiar streets and buildings now seemed foreign, tainted by the revelation that had shattered my sense of normalcy. Inside my apartment, I sat in the dim light, grappling with the searing pain of realization. Sophie's betrayal was no longer a shadow of doubt, it was a glaring truth. The anger and hurt were palpable, a fierce storm that threatened to consume me. I was left with the stark choice of how to navigate this new reality, my mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The weeks that followed were a blur of cold determination and calculated moves. After the confirmation of Sophie's betrayal, the rage that had fueled me now shifted into a steely resolve. I knew I needed to act, and I wanted my revenge to be as precise as it was devastating. My plan took shape, and it revolved around Paul, the man who had so brazenly entangled himself in my life. My apartment became a clandestine workshop. I spent hours at my desk, creating documents that would serve as the cornerstone of my scheme. I had never dabbled in anything like this before, but necessity, they say, is the mother of invention. I needed these documents to look legitimate, to have that ring of authenticity that would make them convincing enough to be taken seriously. I began by researching the elements of a fraud case. What kinds of documents would be required? What would look suspicious to an investigator? I pored over articles and legal documents, and even visited a local library for references on white-collar crime. My goal was to fabricate papers that seemed credible at first glance. In a dimly lit room, surrounded by stacks of paper and a faint whirring printer, I started creating the false evidence. I drafted emails that suggested illicit transactions, financial statements that hinted at irregularities, and correspondence that could be interpreted as conspiracy. Each document was meticulously crafted to avoid detection, with details that could pass for real if scrutinized by a casual observer. I made use of my limited knowledge of accounting to ensure that the figures on the documents seemed plausible. I adjusted numbers, created fake signatures, and simulated the format of official correspondence. Every element was designed to look authentic enough to withstand a basic investigation but discreet enough not to be immediately obvious. Once I had a set of documents I was satisfied with, I placed them in a folder and ensured they were appropriately aged to appear as if they had been there for some time. I even added a bit of wear to the edges, a touch of realism that I hoped would lend credibility. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Paul knocked on my door one evening, just after dinner, asking to borrow a wrench for some minor repairs in his apartment. It was almost poetic. The man who had wrecked my marriage standing there, completely unaware of the trap I was about to set for him. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile that felt like a mask. "Give me a second. I fetched the wrench from the closet, pretending to rummage around while my mind raced ahead, calculating my next move. As I handed him the tool, I asked casually, "While you're at it, mind if I borrow your drill? I've got a couple of things I need to fix myself." Paul, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm demeanor, agreed without hesitation. "Yeah, no problem. It's in the closet, come grab it." I followed him into his apartment, the air thick with the tension only I could feel. His place was almost identical to mine, with the same layout, the same small hallway leading into a cramped living room. But this place, the one my wife had entered so many times, felt hostile, like enemy territory. Paul walked into the kitchen to finish whatever task he'd been working on, leaving me free to find the drill in the hallway closet. My heart raced, but my hands moved with steady precision. This was my moment. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing the edges of the folder, the fake documents I had spent days perfecting. They felt heavy, almost too real for what they represented. The culmination of my plan was about to take place, and there was no room for hesitation now. Opening the closet door, I quickly found the drill on the shelf, just as Paul had said. But instead of grabbing it immediately, I crouched down, pretending to shuffle through a few boxes. My hand moved smoothly as I slipped the folder into one of his bags, tucked under a pile of old papers. I made sure it was easy to find, but not so obvious that it would seem suspicious. Every second stretched longer than it should have. My pulse thundered in my ears, but outwardly, I kept my movements relaxed. The room was silent except for the faint clatter of Paul working in the kitchen. I grabbed the drill, careful not to rush, and called out, "Got it." "Thanks, I'll bring this back later." "No problem," Paul answered from the other room, none the wiser. I left his apartment, the door clicking shut behind me, and exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The folder was now in place, nestled among his personal belongings. In just a matter of time, someone would find it, and the evidence would do its work. Back in the safety of my apartment, I set the drill aside, no longer caring about the trivial repairs I'd used as my excuse. The trap had been set, and now all I had to do was wait. The falsified documents would speak for themselves, and Paul's life would soon unravel in ways he never saw coming. As I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over me. I had crossed the line, and though there was no going back, I felt a strange calm knowing that Paul's downfall was now inevitable. It was a quiet afternoon when the news broke, the kind of day that lulls you into a false sense of calm. I was sitting in my living room, the television on but my thoughts elsewhere, waiting for the inevitable fallout from my plan. I didn't have to wait long. The sound of a commotion in the hallway snapped me back to reality. It started as muffled voices, then the unmistakable clang of heavy boots on the stairs. Curious, I stood up and peeked through the peephole in my door, my pulse quickening. 2 police officers were standing outside Paul's apartment. I watched in disbelief as they knocked on his door, firm but not aggressive, yet. The door opened, and there stood Paul, looking bewildered as the officers spoke to him. I couldn't hear the words, but their expressions, along with the tension in Paul's posture, told me everything I needed to know. They were here for him. My heart raced as I watched the scene unfold. Paul's confusion was clear, his brows furrowed, hands moving in gestures that seemed to say, "This must be some kind of mistake." He shook his head, trying to protest, but the officers weren't having it. I could only imagine the shock he must have felt, standing there, blindsided by accusations he couldn't begin to comprehend. They said something else to him, likely the charges. Fraud, misinformation, the weight of those false documents I had planted. Paul's face went pale, his mouth moving silently as he tried to grasp the situation. His shock was genuine. He looked like a man whose world had just flipped upside down, and I realized at that moment that he truly had no idea what was coming. He didn't even know he'd been set up. "Please, there must be some kind of mistake," I heard him say as I cracked my door open slightly, just enough to catch a few words. His voice was strained, filled with disbelief. He couldn't understand how this could be happening to him, and to an outside observer, he seemed like a man desperately trying to wake from a nightmare. The officers, unmoved by his pleas, calmly but firmly informed him that he was under arrest. They read him his rights as they placed handcuffs around his wrists. The cold metal snapped shut with an audible click, and that was it. Paul was led out of his apartment, his face a mixture of shock and panic. His eyes darted around, searching for answers, for some kind of explanation, but there were none. The weight of the accusations, the false evidence I had carefully planted, now hung over him like a guillotine. He stumbled slightly as they guided him down the stairs, his protests barely a whisper by the time they reached the door. As they disappeared from view, I closed my door quietly, standing in the silence of my apartment. I felt the adrenaline surging through me, but there was also a strange stillness. It was done. Paul was now in the hands of the law, entangled in a web I had spun so carefully, and there was no escape for him. For a brief moment, I thought about Sophie, about how she would react when she found out. Her lover was caught in a scandal that would ruin him. She had betrayed me, and now her world was about to collapse, just like Paul's. But as I sat back down, the satisfaction I had expected didn't come. Instead, there was a strange emptiness. I had wanted justice, or maybe just revenge, but now that it was happening, it felt different. The reality of watching someone's life fall apart, even someone like Paul, was heavier than I had imagined. Still, I knew I couldn't stop now. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Paul's arrest was only the beginning. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through her phone. I could see the tension in her shoulders and the rigid way she held herself, trying to maintain composure. But it wasn't working. The news was spreading fast, and there was no way for her to escape it. Paul's arrest had hit the neighborhood like a bombshell. People were talking, whispering in hushed tones about fraud, about the man who had seemed so normal, so trustworthy. I had heard snippets of gossip on my way back from the store earlier, and it was clear that the scandal had already taken on a life of its own. And now, sitting across from me, Sophie was living that reality. She hadn't said much since she found out. I could tell she was trying to play it cool, trying to act as though this wasn't affecting her. But I knew better. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at me for too long. Her facade was cracking, and she was struggling to hold it together. "So, did you hear about Paul?" I asked, my voice casual, almost detached. She flinched slightly, her fingers freezing over the phone screen. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide with forced calm. "Yeah, I heard." Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "It's crazy, right? I mean, fraud? I don't even know what to think." She was lying, of course. I could see it in the way she bit her lip, the way her fingers gripped the phone a little too tightly. She was scared, not just for Paul, but for herself. The scandal surrounding him was more than just a legal issue. It was a social disaster, and Sophie was tangled in it, whether she admitted it or not. I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. "Crazy," I echoed. "I wonder how deep it goes." "You think he's guilty?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward me before darting away again. I don't know. I mean, Paul never seemed like that kind of guy. It's just hard to believe. I could feel her panic rising, though she was trying desperately to keep her voice steady. But the cracks were there, and I reveled in watching her struggle to maintain her composure. Every word, every forced expression of disbelief, was a sign that she was unraveling. And it wasn't just Paul she was worried about. Sophie had been a part of his life, more than I could stomach to think about. But now, that connection threatened to drag her down with him. In the days that followed, the news of Paul's arrest spread like wildfire. People whispered about him at the grocery store, neighbors exchanged glances, and the whispers became rumors. The more people talked, the more they speculated. And with every passing day, it became harder for Sophie to hide. At first, she tried to keep up appearances, going about her daily routine as though nothing had changed. But I noticed the subtle signs, how she avoided eye contact with our neighbors, how she checked her phone constantly, hoping for updates or, perhaps, reassurance that this nightmare would pass. But the scandal only grew. Paul's business associates distanced themselves from him. His name was dragged through the mud in local papers, and soon enough, it wasn't just Paul's reputation that was on the line. Whispers started circulating about Sophie. People started asking questions about her relationship with him, about how close they had been. It wasn't long before Sophie began to feel the weight of those questions. She came home one evening, her face pale, her hands shaking as she dropped her keys on the counter. "Everyone's talking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't need to explain who everyone was. The tension in the air was palpable. I ran into Jane from down the street. She asked about Paul, if I had heard anything. I didn't know what to say. I watched her unravel, piece by piece, as the world around her began to close in. She was trapped, caught in the very scandal she had tried so hard to avoid. And now, her life, her reputation, her comfortable little world, everything was crumbling. Sophie tried to hide it, but I could see her panic growing with each passing day. She no longer hummed in the mornings, her usual routines disrupted by the anxiety gnawing at her. Her sleep was restless, her eyes haunted by the weight of her fears. It wasn't just Paul who was going down. Sophie's world was about to collapse too. And the best part? She didn't even realize I was behind it all. It didn't take long for the story to catch fire. What had started as a quiet arrest soon became the talk of the town. And then the headlines. Paul's alleged fraud was splashed across every local news outlet, but it wasn't just his legal troubles that caught people's attention. It was the whispers of something more personal, something much juicier. Sophie had tried to stay under the radar, to let the storm pass unnoticed, but scandals have a way of dragging everyone involved into the light. And she wasn't just anyone, she was the wife of the man who had set all of this in motion, though she didn't know that part. To the world, she was simply the woman caught in the web of Paul's downfall. The real blow came when our nosy old neighbor, Margaret, decided to go public. She had always been the type to keep an eye on everything, living her days with one ear pressed to the door and the other tuned into the neighborhood gossip. And now, she had something worth sharing. The media, desperate for any new angle on Paul's case, lapped it up. Margaret gave an exclusive interview, recounting how she had seen it all. According to her, Sophie had been visiting Paul's apartment for months, always sneaking around when I was at work as if trying to keep their relationship a secret. She described how Sophie would linger at Paul's door, how the two of them had seemed closer than just neighbors. The interview was juicy, scandalous, and impossible to ignore. As soon as the story hit the press, it was over for Sophie. The headlines weren't about fraud anymore, they were about betrayal. Businessman's fraud tied to scandalous affair, read one. Wife of local man linked to lover's criminal activity, screamed another. People ate it up, the public's appetite for gossip growing with every new detail. The narrative shifted from Paul's financial crimes to Sophie's ones. I watched it all unfold with a strange detachment, almost as if it were happening to someone else. Sophie, once the center of my world, was now the center of a scandal that was too big to contain. She couldn't hide from it, and she couldn't deny it. The whispers from neighbors turned into outright accusations. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues at her workplace gave her the cold shoulder. At home, Sophie's silence was deafening. She no longer tried to explain herself and pretended everything was fine. The weight of public judgment had crushed her spirit, and the accusations of infidelity stung more deeply than she could bear. One evening, after days of awkward, strained silence, she finally spoke. "Greg, you know this isn't true, right? What they're saying, it's all been blown out of proportion." Her voice wavered, pleading, but there was no conviction left in her words. I just stared at her, letting the moment hang in the air. She looked at me, waiting for some sign of support, some reassurance that I was still on her side. But there was none. I had nothing left to give her. "Sophie," I said quietly, my voice flat, "I think you need to face reality." She blinked as if trying to understand what I was saying, as if the full weight of my words hadn't quite hit her yet. But then she saw it. The coldness in my eyes. The finality in my tone. Her face crumpled, her expression shifting from confusion to despair. "You're leaving me?" she whispered, as though the thought had just occurred to her. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence was the answer she feared. And just like that, Sophie was alone. The friends who had once surrounded her, the colleagues who had respected her, all of them had turned away. They didn't want to be associated with someone caught in the middle of such a scandal. Even her closest friends had started distancing themselves, afraid of what being connected to her might do to their reputations. In the eyes of the world, she was guilty. Guilty of the affair, guilty of betraying her husband, guilty of aligning herself with a criminal. And in my eyes, too, she had lost everything. The woman who had once been so sure of herself, so confident, now stood on the edge of ruin, stripped of the life she had built. She had no more excuses to make, no one left to defend her. I watched her crumble, knowing that this was only the beginning. The life she had destroyed with Paul would now come crashing down around her, leaving nothing but the wreckage of her choices. Sophie wasn't the same after the scandal broke. At first, she tried to keep it together, to manage the damage to her reputation by acting as though she could fix everything with just a few conversations and a few explanations. But as the days went by, I noticed the cracks deepening. She wasn't just losing her social standing, she was losing herself. And then, the suspicion started. It was subtle at first. I caught her watching me a little too closely, her eyes lingering when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She had started pacing more, her mind working overtime to make sense of the nightmare she was trapped in. It didn't take long for her to start connecting the dots, though she still didn't have the full picture. Yet, one evening, after dinner, she stood in the doorway of the living room, her arms crossed, tension radiating from her. "You've been distant lately," she said, her voice cautious but probing. I looked up from the television, keeping my face neutral. "Distant? I'm just trying to keep to myself. This whole thing with Paul has been a lot." She didn't respond right away, but I could feel her eyes on me, searching for something in my face. I didn't flinch, didn't give her anything to grab onto. "I just don't understand how everything fell apart so quickly," she said, pacing again. "It's like everything's against me. First Paul, then my friends, now work. And it all seems so perfectly timed. Almost like someone planned it." I could see the wheels turning in her head, the paranoia creeping in. She was starting to realize that this wasn't just bad luck, it was sabotage. And she was close to suspecting me. I stood up, walking over to her with a look of concern. "Sophie, you're stressed. You've been through hell these last few weeks. I get it, but now's not the time for conspiracy theories. Paul screwed up, and unfortunately, you got caught in the crossfire. None of this is your fault." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. But I knew her too well. Behind her silence, I could sense the growing unease, the uncertainty about whether or not to believe me. I placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "I'm on your side, Sophie. I always have been." She nodded slowly, but the doubt in her eyes didn't fade. I could feel her slipping further away, retreating into her thoughts. Into the storm of paranoia and questions that swirled around her. And that's when I knew it was time to turn up the pressure. Blank. Underscore, blank. Over the next few days, I started laying the groundwork for my next move. Subtle, almost imperceptible actions, designed to make Sophie question everything. I'd accidentally leave articles open on my laptop about workplace scandals and marital infidelity, knowing she'd see them. I started talking to friends on the phone more, dropping hints about trust and how hard it is to rebuild once it's lost. Each time, Sophie would overhear just enough to make her feel the sting of doubt. She grew more restless, more anxious. I could see it in the way she checked her phone constantly, her eyes darting to me as if trying to read my thoughts. She started asking me strange questions, innocent on the surface, but with an edge of accusation beneath them. One night, she couldn't hold it in anymore. "Greg," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you think someone could have set me up? Maybe someone close to me?" I raised an eyebrow, playing my part. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "It's just too much. Paul's arrest, the media frenzy, the neighbors. Even Margaret. It's like someone wanted to destroy me, and I don't know who." I acted hurt. "Sophie, you can't seriously be thinking I had anything to do with this?" Her eyes darted to mine, then quickly away. "No, of course not," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's just, everything feels wrong." "Look," I said, sitting down beside her, "I get that you're looking for answers, but you're starting to see enemies where there aren't any. I'd never hurt you. You're my wife." Her breath hitched, and I could see the internal battle playing out on her face. She wanted to believe me, to hold on to the idea that I was still the man she could trust, but the paranoia was too strong. The pressure I'd been applying was working. Blank. Underscore, blank. A few days later, I took things a step further. I planted the smallest clue, a deleted email on her laptop, restored just enough for her to see the subject line, Paul's financial records. It was vague and nondescript, but I knew it would be enough to send her spiraling further into suspicion. That evening, when she found it, I watched her crumble. She didn't confront me immediately, but I could feel the tension between us thickening like a fog. Sophie spent the rest of the night glued to her computer, trying to piece together the puzzle, searching for more clues to confirm her growing suspicion. I made sure to act as though nothing was wrong, staying one step ahead of her at every turn. Each time she tried to dig deeper, I subtly covered my tracks, making sure she would always be left wondering if she was imagining things. The psychological strain was wearing her down, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she cracked. Every glance she threw my way now carried weight, doubt, fear, and, most importantly, guilt. Sophie was starting to realize that her world was falling apart, and somewhere deep down, she knew I was connected to it. But I would never give her the satisfaction of admitting it. I was still the supportive husband on the surface, but underneath, I was slowly dismantling her reality, piece by piece. The more she questioned me, the deeper her paranoia grew. And soon, she wouldn't be able to tell the truth from lies. That's when I would make my final move. I heard the door close with a quiet click. Sophie had come home, but something about her footsteps was different, quieter, more deliberate. I sat in the living room, pretending to be absorbed in a book, though my heart was pounding. I had known this moment was coming. The game I had been playing, the strings I had been pulling, were finally going to unravel. She walked in slowly, standing just inside the doorway, her face pale but set in a hard, determined expression. There was no small talk, no feigned politeness. She knew. "I know it was you," Sophie said, her voice strained but steady. "All of it, the documents, the rumors, Paul's arrest. You did this." I didn't move. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. There was no point in denying it now, the game was over. I slowly closed the book and placed it on the coffee table, meeting her gaze. "Yes," I said quietly. "I did." Her face twisted in a mix of shock and pain. She had known, but hearing the admission made it real. "Why?" Her voice cracked, raw with emotion. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" I stood up, my movements deliberate, as if I were finally shedding the last bit of pretense. "You betrayed me, Sophie. You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see what was going on with you and Paul?" My words came out harsher than I intended, years of resentment boiling to the surface. She flinched as if struck, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This was about that? About Paul? You destroyed everything because She stopped, choking on the words. "I made a mistake, Greg." A mistake?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You didn't just make a mistake, Sophie. You lied to me. You cheated on me. You threw our marriage away for him, and now you're surprised that there are consequences?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Not yet. She had to understand. She had to feel what I had felt, the betrayal, the anger, the isolation. "I didn't destroy anything, Sophie," I continued, my voice dropping back to a cold, even tone. "You did that yourself. I just gave you a push in the direction you were already heading." She stood there, trembling, her face pale. For a moment, I thought she might lash out and scream at me, but instead, she just let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. "You're worse than I ever thought. I never imagined you could do something so cruel. This isn't about us anymore, is it? It's about your revenge." I didn't respond immediately, because at that moment, something inside me shifted. Hearing her say it out loud, seeing the devastation on her face, it didn't feel as satisfying as I had imagined it would. I had spent so long planning, manipulating, tearing her life apart bit by bit, and now, standing here in the wreckage of it all, I felt empty. The revenge I had built my life around, the revenge that I thought would give me closure, had left me hollow instead. Sophie took a step closer, wiping away her tears. "I'm done," she whispered. "You've taken everything. Paul's gone. My career's in ruins, my friends won't even speak to me. You've won, Greg, but in the process, you've destroyed yourself too." Her words hung in the air like a weight I couldn't shake off. She was right. I had won, but at what cost? I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who cared more about tearing her down than about moving forward with my own life. For the first time in months, I felt tired, exhausted, even. The weight of everything I had done, every scheme, every lie, suddenly pressed down on me all at once. "I never wanted it to be like this," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. I thought if I made you feel the same pain, the same betrayal, it would make things right. But it didn't. Sophie shook her head, her expression one of deep sadness. "It never does." We stood there in silence, the distance between us too vast to cross. Whatever had existed between us was gone, shattered beyond repair. I had spent so much time focused on vengeance that I had forgotten what came after. And now, standing in the rubble of our lives, I was left with nothing. "I'm leaving," Sophie said after a long pause. There's nothing left here for me. Not anymore. I nodded, unable to argue. She was right, there was nothing left. The marriage we had once shared was dead, and the person I had become in my quest for revenge wasn't someone she could ever love again. Hell, he wasn't someone I could love anymore. She turned to leave, but before she stepped out the door, she looked back at me one last time. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Greg. But I'm not going to be a part of it. Blank. Underscore, blank. In the days that followed, I was left alone with my thoughts. The empty house a constant reminder of everything that had happened. Paul was still in jail, Sophie was gone, and the life I had once known was over. I had won, yes. But victory felt like ashes in my mouth. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think about the future, not about Sophie, or Paul, or revenge, but about me. What was left for me now that the battle was over? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep living in the past. It was time to leave the bitterness, the anger, and the hurt behind. As I stood by the window, looking out over the quiet street, I took a deep breath. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Somewhere out there, Sophie was starting her life over, and maybe, in some way, I could too. It was time to let go. Time to move on.